A weathered rancher who never asked for anything discovers that home isn't a place you find, it's something someone builds around you. The smell hit first. Not the familiar tang of leather and dust that clung to every surface in Copper Ridge, but something else, something wrong. Sweet, metallic, like pennies left too long in summer rain. Jake Morrison pressed his weathered palm against the saloon's batwing doors, the wood grain rough beneath his calloused fingers. 23 years he'd been pushing through these same doors, and never once had they trembled like this. Not from wind, from something inside. The hinges creaked their familiar protest, but underneath, a sound that didn't belong. Scratching, deliberate, like fingernails on pine. "Martha?" His voice cut through the amber-lit interior of the Broken Wheel Saloon. No answer. Just that scratching, coming from behind the bar where Martha Henley had served whiskey and wisdom for longer than most folks had been breathing. Jake's boots found the floorboards with practiced silence. 30 years of tracking rustlers had taught him to move like smoke when the situation called for it. The scratching stopped. Behind the bar, Martha knelt beside a loose floorboard, her silver hair catching the lamplight. In her hands, a small metal box, its surface green with age. Her fingers shook as she worked at the latch. "Martha," she startled, nearly dropping the box. When she looked up, her eyes held something Jake had never seen there before. Fear. Jake Morrison. Her voice carried the weight of years, but also something else. Relief, I was hoping. I was praying you'd come. "What's in the box, Martha?" She stood slowly, her knees protesting the movement. The box remained clutched against her chest like a shield. 30 years I've kept this buried. 30 years I've watched you ride through those doors, never asking for nothing from nobody. Never taking what wasn't freely given. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his hip, where his Colt had rested for 3 decades. But this wasn't that kind of danger. This was something else entirely. "Today's different," Martha continued. "Today someone's finally asking." The letter had arrived that morning with the supply wagon from Denver. Official paper. Government seal. The kind that usually meant trouble for folks who preferred to handle their own affairs. Martha set the metal box on the bar between them and opened it with reverent care. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a deed. The paper was yellow with age, the ink brown as dried blood, but the words were clear enough. Copper Ridge Ranch, established 1847, deeded to. Martha's voice faltered. Jake leaned closer. The name on the deed wasn't his. Wasn't anyone's he recognized. But the signature at the bottom made his blood run cold. Thomas Morrison. His father. "I don't understand." Jake's voice came out rougher than intended. "My father never owned land. We were drifters. Always moving." Martha's eyes held 30 years of secrets. "Your father owned more than land, Jake. He owned this whole valley. Every acre from the river to the ridgeline. Every building. Every business." She paused, letting the weight of it settle, including this saloon. The scratching sound returned, but now Jake realized what it was. Martha's fingernails working nervously against the box's metal edge. "A habit born of keeping secrets too long. The letter that came today," she continued. "It's from a lawyer in Denver. Seems someone's been asking questions about the Morrison estate. Someone who knows you're here." Jake studied the deed again. The date was clear. March 15th, 1847. 2 months before he was born. 2 months before his father disappeared, leaving Jake and his mother to fend for themselves. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because your father made me promise. Said if anything happened to him, I was to keep this buried until you were ready. Until you'd proven yourself worthy of it." "Worthy of what?" Martha's smile was sad and knowing. "Of having something worth staying for." The back room of the Broken Wheel held more than whiskey barrels and playing cards. Behind a false wall that Martha revealed with practiced ease lay a space Jake had never imagined existed. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on walls lined with ledgers, maps, and photographs. "Your father wasn't just a rancher," Martha explained, lighting another lamp. "He was the founder of Copper Ridge. Every family that settled here, he brought them. Every business that thrived, he backed it. This wasn't just a town to him. It was a vision." Jake ran his fingers along the spines of the ledgers. Each one bore a year, starting with 1847 and ending abruptly in 1848, the year his father vanished. What happened to him? Martha pulled down a photograph from the wall. It showed a man Jake recognized from his own reflection, the same weathered features, the same steady eyes. But this man wore fine clothes and stood beside a woman in an elegant dress. Behind them, the framework of what would become Copper Ridge. He fell in love, Martha said simply, with your mother. And with the idea that love was enough to build a life on. Jake studied the photograph. His mother looked young, happy. Nothing like the worn woman who'd raised him alone, always looking over her shoulder, always ready to run. She knew about this place. She knew about the money, the land, the responsibility that came with it. Martha set the photograph aside and opened one of the ledgers. She also knew about the men who wanted it. The ledger pages revealed a different story than Jake had expected. Not just records of land purchases and business investments, but correspondence. Letters from men in Denver, in San Francisco, in Washington. Men who saw opportunity in the growing territory and didn't much care who got hurt in the taking. Your father made enemies, Martha continued. Powerful ones, men who saw this valley as theirs for the claiming, and your father as an obstacle to be removed. Jake's finger traced a particular entry. A payment made to M. Henley for services rendered. The amount was substantial. You were on his payroll. I was his friend. The money was for keeping watch. For keeping records. For keeping you safe when the time came. Safe from what? Martha closed the ledger with a soft thud. From the same men who killed your father. Sheriff Coleman arrived as the sun reached its zenith, his badge catching the light like a signal mirror. Jake had known Coleman for 15 years, had even helped him track down rustlers on more than one occasion. But the man who walked through the saloon doors wasn't the same one who'd shared whiskey and war stories. This man moved with purpose. With authority that went beyond a sheriff's star, Jake Morrison. Coleman's voice carried an edge Jake had never heard before. Heard you've been digging into old business. Martha stepped protectively in front of the bar, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders. This wasn't unexpected, just learning about my inheritance, Sheriff. Nothing illegal about that. Coleman's laugh held no humor. Inheritance, that's what you're calling it. He moved closer, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Funny thing about inheritances, Jake, sometimes they come with debts attached. What kind of debts? The kind your father accumulated when he decided to play kingmaker in this valley. The kind that don't disappear just because a man does. Jake felt the familiar weight of his Colt against his hip, but something in Coleman's manner suggested this wasn't about gunplay. This was about something more dangerous. Information. See, your father made promises, Coleman continued. To investors. To partners. To men who put their money behind his vision of Copper Ridge. He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. This here's a contract, signed by Thomas Morrison, guaranteeing return on investment within 10 years of his death. Jake took the paper, his eyes scanning the legal language. The numbers at the bottom made his stomach clench. More money than existed in the entire territory. That's impossible. My father didn't have that kind of money. No, Coleman agreed. But his son does, or will, once he claims his inheritance. Martha's voice cut through the tension like a blade. That contract's a forgery, Coleman. And you know it. The sheriff's smile was cold as winter wind. Prove it. I can do better than that. Martha reached beneath the bar and produced a second document. I can show you the real contract. The one your employers don't want anyone to see. Coleman's hand moved to his gun, but Jake was faster. Not drawing, just ready. The kind of ready that came from 30 years of staying alive in a hard country. Easy, Sheriff. Let's see what Martha's got to say. The document Martha produced changed everything. Not a contract, but a confession. Written in Thomas Morrison's hand, dated the day before his disappearance. To whoever finds this record, I have discovered that the men I trusted to help build Copper Ridge have been using my name and resources to steal land from the families I brought here. They have forged documents, falsified claims, and murdered those who opposed them. I fear for my life and for the future of this valley. If something happens to me, the evidence is hidden where only my son will think to look. Trust no one in authority. The corruption goes deeper than anyone knows. Jake read the confession twice before the full meaning sank in. His father hadn't abandoned them. He'd been murdered for trying to protect the very people he'd brought to Copper Ridge. Where's the evidence? He asked. Martha's eyes flicked to Coleman, who stood frozen by the revelation. Your father was clever. He hid it somewhere only you would understand. Somewhere connected to your mother. Jake's mind raced through memories. His mother had been secretive about their past, but she'd always kept one thing from their old life. A music box, simple, wooden, with a melody that reminded her of better times. The music box. Martha nodded. She never knew what was inside it. Your father modified it before he gave it to her. Added a hidden compartment. Coleman's voice cut through their conversation like a whip crack. Enough! His gun was drawn now, pointed steadily at Jake's chest. That music box burned with your mother's cabin 5 years ago. Whatever evidence existed died with it. Did it? Jake's voice was calm, but his mind was working furiously. The music box hadn't burned. He'd saved it from the fire, one of the few things he'd managed to rescue. It sat now on the mantel of his small cabin, a reminder of the woman who'd raised him alone. Coleman's eyes narrowed. You're bluffing. Maybe. But are you willing to bet your life on it? The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire. Martha stood perfectly still, her hands visible on the bar top. Jake could feel the weight of his Colt, the familiar grip worn smooth by years of use. But this wasn't about who was faster with a gun. This was about who had more to lose. Here's what's going to happen, Coleman said finally. You're going to sign over that deed to the rightful owners, the men who invested in your father's vision and deserve to see it fulfilled. And if I don't? Coleman's smile was ugly. Then you'll have an accident. Just like your father did. The music box sat on Jake's kitchen table like a judgment. Martha had insisted on coming with him despite the danger. Coleman had given them until sunset to produce the evidence or sign the deed. 3 hours to decide between justice and survival. Your father was a good man, Martha said, running her fingers along the box's carved edges. But he was naive. He thought he could trust people just because they wore badges or carried official papers. Jake found the hidden mechanism exactly where his instincts told him it would be. A small pressure point disguised as part of the decorative carving. The false bottom opened with a soft click, revealing a space just large enough for a rolled document. The papers inside told a story of corruption that reached from Copper Ridge to the territorial capital. Names, dates, amounts. A systematic plan to steal an entire valley's worth of land and resources. Coleman's name appeared frequently, along with others Jake recognized. The banker, the territorial judge, even the minister. They killed him for this, Jake said, holding up a particular page, for trying to protect people who trusted him. And they'll kill you for the same reason. Martha's voice was gentle but firm, unless you give them what they want. Jake stared out his cabin window at the valley his father had built. Copper Ridge spread below them like a promise kept. Families working their land, children playing in the streets. A community that existed because one man had believed in something better. What would you do? He asked. Martha was quiet for a long moment. I'd remember that your father didn't die for land or money. He died for the idea that people deserve better than what powerful men are willing to give them. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western ridge. Soon Coleman would come for an answer. And Jake would have to choose between the safety of silence and the danger of truth. There's a third option, Martha said suddenly. What's that? We make sure the evidence gets to someone who can use it. Someone outside Coleman's reach. Jake considered this. The federal marshal in Denver? Better. The newspaper editor in San Francisco. Man named Patterson. He's been investigating territorial corruption for months. This would give him everything he needs. And then? Martha's smile was grim. Then we see how brave Coleman really is when he's facing federal charges instead of just one stubborn rancher. They met Coleman at the Broken Wheel as the sun touched the ridge line. The sheriff wasn't alone. 3 men Jake didn't recognize flanked him, their hands resting casually on their weapons. Professional gunmen by the look of them. Well, Coleman's voice carried the confidence of a man who held all the cards. Jake set the deed on the bar between them. Unsigned. I've got a counter-proposal. Coleman's eyes narrowed. You're not in a position to negotiate. Maybe not. But I'm in a position to make things very expensive for your employers. Jake pulled out a single sheet from the evidence cache. This is a list of every illegal land grab in the territory over the past 5 years. Names, dates, amounts. Very detailed. One of Coleman's men shifted nervously. Jake caught the movement and filed it away. Not all of them were as confident as their leader. You're bluffing, Coleman said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Jake folded the paper and slipped it back into his vest. Here's my offer. You and your friends ride out of Copper Ridge tonight. Never come back. In exchange, this evidence stays buried. And if we don't? Martha spoke for the first time since they'd entered. Then copies of everything get delivered to every newspaper between here and Washington, along with a full confession from me about what I've witnessed over the past 30 years. Coleman's hand moved to his gun, but Jake was ready. not to draw, to speak. Before you do something stupid, Sheriff, you might want to know that we're not the only ones who've seen this evidence. It was a lie, but a convincing one. Coleman hesitated. The federal marshal in Denver received a full copy this morning, Jake continued, along with a letter explaining that if anything happens to me or Martha, he should consider it confirmation that everything in those documents is true. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Jake could see Coleman weighing his options, calculating odds. The sheriff was a careful man. It's how he'd survived this long in a corrupt system. You're making a mistake, Coleman said finally. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. Coleman holstered his weapon and nodded to his men. This isn't over. Yes, Jake said quietly. It is. They left that night just as Jake had demanded. Coleman and his hired guns, riding hard toward the territorial line. But Jake knew it wasn't really over. Men like Coleman didn't give up. They just changed tactics. The real test came 3 days later when a federal marshal arrived from Denver. Not the corrupt official Jake had expected, but a young man named Harrison who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen enough injustice to recognize it when it crossed his path. Mr. Morrison, Harrison said, settling into a chair at the broken wheel. I understand you have some information about territorial corruption. Jake studied the marshal's face, looking for signs of deception. Finding none, he made his choice. I have evidence of a conspiracy to steal land from settlers across the territory. Murder, forgery, bribery, the whole catalog of crimes. Harrison listened without interruption as Jake laid out the story. The evidence. The threats. Coleman's involvement. When Jake finished, the marshal was quiet for a long moment. This is substantial, Harrison said finally. But prosecuting territorial officials is complicated, political, dangerous. More dangerous than letting them continue. Harrison smiled, the first genuine expression Jake had seen from him. No, you're right about that. He stood and extended his hand. I'll need to take the evidence with me. For safekeeping, Jake hesitated. Once he handed over those documents, he'd be trusting his life to a man he'd known for less than an hour. How do I know you're not part of this? You don't, Harrison admitted. But you know what happens if you do nothing. Jake looked around the saloon, at Martha behind the bar, at the familiar faces of neighbors and friends. People who'd built lives here based on the promise his father had made. People who deserved better than what corrupt men were willing to give them. He handed over the evidence. 6 months later, the trials began. Coleman and 12 other territorial officials faced federal charges ranging from fraud to murder. The evidence Jake had preserved proved decisive, detailed enough to convict, comprehensive enough to dismantle an entire network of corruption. Jake stood on the porch of his cabin, watching the sun set over Copper Ridge. The valley looked the same as it always had, but something fundamental had changed. The fear that had hung over the community like smoke was gone, replaced by something Jake had never experienced before. Security, belonging, home. Your father would be proud, Martha said, joining him on the porch. She carried 2 cups of coffee and the easy manner of someone whose secrets had finally been shared. Would he? He built this place for people like you. People who understand that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible. Jake accepted the coffee gratefully. I never asked for any of this. No, Martha agreed. That's what made you worthy of it. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the lights come on in the houses below. Families gathering for dinner. Children being called in from play. The ordinary miracles of a community at peace. What will you do now? Martha asked. Jake considered the question. The deed to Copper Ridge Ranch sat in his cabin, officially his, now that the legal challenges had been resolved. Thousands of acres, enough wealth to live comfortably for the rest of his life, enough responsibility to keep him busy for decades. I think I'll stay, he said finally. See what kind of place this can become when good people are free to build it. Martha's smile was warm as summer sunshine. I gave you everything I could, she said softly. Your father's legacy, the truth about your past, the choice about your future. Jake nodded, understanding finally what she meant. Home wasn't something you found. It was something you chose to build, something you chose to protect, something you chose to share with people who mattered. Thank you, he said. For what? For keeping your promise. For waiting until I was ready, Martha chuckled. 30 years is a long time to keep a secret, but worth it? She looked out over the valley, at the community that had survived corruption and violence and the simple passage of time. Ask me in another 30 years. Jake laughed, a sound that surprised him with its ease. For the first time in his life, he could imagine 30 years from now. Could imagine building something that would last. Could imagine being the kind of man his father had been. Someone who understood that the best inheritance you could leave was a place where good people could thrive. The stars were coming out now, bright and clear in the mountain air. Jake Morrison, who had never asked for anything from anyone, finally understood what it meant to have everything he needed. He was home. 10 years later, Copper Ridge had grown into one of the most prosperous communities in the territory. The Morrison Ranch employed dozens of families, and Jake had established a school, a church, and a lending library. Martha Henley still ran the Broken Wheel Saloon, though she'd added a dining room that served the best meals within 100 miles. Federal Marshal Harrison had been promoted to territorial administrator, and his first act was to establish new oversight procedures that prevented the kind of corruption that had once plagued the region. Coleman and his associates served their sentences in federal prison, their stolen wealth returned to the families they'd cheated. Jake never married, but he was never alone. The community he'd chosen to protect had chosen to protect him in return, creating the kind of family that transcends blood relations. On quiet evenings, he would sit on his porch and remember his father's words, preserved in that final confession. Trust no one in authority. The corruption goes deeper than anyone knows. But Jake had learned something his father hadn't lived long enough to discover. Sometimes, if you're willing to take the risk, you can find people worthy of trust. Sometimes, if you're willing to fight for it, you can build something better than what came before. Sometimes, home finds you when you're finally ready to be found.